Hi there. I'm on my way, I'm making it. I've got to make it show, yeah. So much larger than life. I'm gonna watch it growing. The place where I come from is a small town. They think so small, they use small words. But not me, I'm smarter than that. I worked it out. I've been stretching my mouth to let those big words come right out. I've had enough, I'm getting out to the city.
Welcome to Parev TV. Once again, we join you with yet another exciting program, an interview with a great Armenian nobleman, scientist, physicist, and literary personality. His name is Dr. Bedros Afeyan. He is a theoretical physicist, applied mathematician. He was born in Lebanon, moved to Canada, and now resides in San Francisco. He is the president and the CEO of his company, Polymath Research. He's also the editor of literary Armenian news Guru. He's a literary critic of books and films that deal with Armenians and Armenian issues. He also paints, he sculpts, and he writes poetry. I don't know what else we can expect in a human being, but it is a great pleasure for me to talk to you, Dr. Afeyan, Bedros Afeyan.
Hey, that's a bad start.
We didn't start yet, and you start telling me.
I'm the other Dr. Afeyan.
I did not know how it was going to be brought up, but since early in the game you bring it up, let me just say Dr. Bedros Afeyan is the older brother of the very well-known, world-renowned Noubar Afeyan. So now that is out of the way. But Bedros, thank you for joining us. I really mean it. And let me, as you know, tell you and tell the listeners and viewers that the way I came across the interview with you is a poem which appeared in the Grung literary section. It was entitled "Beirut is Not for Turks." That is something you wrote just after the explosion, the blast in Beirut, which shook the Armenian community in the world, really, and Lebanese. Tell us how you felt about the explosion and what made you write that very powerful poem of yours.
Well, it seems to me that there are a lot of, the French word is préjugés. There are a lot of preconceived notions about the Lebanese, about Arabs, about the Middle East, which is fueled by lack of knowledge and lack of appreciation of differences in between cultures. And so I thought one of the advantages of being Armenian is that while we're not, for instance, I grew up in Montreal, as you said, and everybody discriminated against me in school immediately because I was from Lebanon. Now that was funny to me because I wasn't Lebanese. So I know what it's like to sort of feel the brunt of, and these were not even Americans, they were Canadians, and they were Jesuits. I mean, they were supposed to be sophisticated. And yet they watch TV and they learn to hate or disrespect because of the common culture. So knowing that the common culture denigrates Arabs, I thought that this enormous tragedy, it's the largest explosion since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it's a subject I know something about. So it's not funny. So I thought, a country that has been molested by its neighbors, that continues to be thought of as waste paper that can be treated any way anybody feels is something worth pointing out for the dignity of man. So it's just a little attempt at, howling at the wind, I guess.
You know, you have written so many poems and you are very much respected. Your writing is very much respected. I'm just discovering you, and I don't know where you were hiding because I'm pretty close to the Armenian community. At one point, you had indicated that your parents or your mom's side is from Urfa. You know, every
Yes,
Armenian wants
correct.
to know, where is Bedros Afeyan's parents from? Urderen and Asong.
Adapazar. We consider ourselves Adapazar and Boris, and then from my mother's side, Urfa.
You know, and you use the three words describing your mom, and there are three powerful words that begin with the letter S, and they are: she sacrificed, she has suffered, and she has shared her courage and love incessantly. You know, what memories does it bring when we speak about mom or dad or grandpa?
Well, I mean, a lot. There was another significant member of our family whom I think I was inspired by the most, which is my great aunt, which is to say my grandfather's sister.
Oh.
She was a very famous person who went by the name of Tanti. So my father's aunt. Her name was Armenuhi Israelian, and she lived to be 100. So this is what I always feel sorry for the Turks, is if we keep on living to be 100, that's a bum deal for them. And she, of course, grew up in Adapazar, and then she saw everything. She saw the First World War, the Second World War. She was in Eastern Europe, and then she lived with us. She was 74 when she joined us in Beirut, because my father had 3 sons and to help out mom. And she was an incredibly learned person. So she read incessantly, and she cared. She cared about female hygiene. So this is at a time when, as you can imagine, Armenian old-fashioned women didn't know anything about contraception or hygiene or these things. She went to the Karagözyan Foundation and gave female hygiene lessons, which of course is a scandalous subject nobody else would talk about. And she did all this, which is a very interesting story that nobody tells, but it means a lot to me, and I haven't written it up. It's because her husband, who was older than her, who was dead by then, had been a doctor in the Ottoman army. Now, I find that stupendously interesting from a historical point of view. So during the genocide, he was in the Turkish army. And what she could say is he made a Garmir Voski every week, was some big achievement. I think the people are being genocided, which of course she was totally against, and her brothers were taken away and all this sort of thing. But he was also syphilis expert. Now, the funny thing is that if you're a syphilis expert before penicillin, you just hold the hand of the guy who's dying. There's nothing you can do. So he was looking at these generals and trying to, give them a little solace while they were dying, which I figured, okay, is a good way to spend the genocide years. That was a joke. So this guy, after the war, went to Greece and helped out all the Greek Armenian orphans by taking care of their eyes. All their eyes were, I think the technical term is effed up. So, and she became a nurse. I mean, she was a rich family's only daughter, and so on. And she became a nurse who helped out thousands upon thousands of kids in Greece, Armenian kids in the Fix area, as it's called, where they're like the Burj Hamud of Greece, Athens, to get better. So their eyes were taken care of. They would have all been blinded. And so even my brother, my middle brother, the one we haven't mentioned, the only one whose son is a PhD. So there's a PhD in all 3 of us now. So and who has a grandson. So that brother's wife, her parents were treated by Tanti, by Grandmama, in Athens when they were there before they went to Argentina. So she was the rock who explained to us about her brother, what I used to call the real Bedros Afeyan, I think I'm taking over that role now. But when I was a kid, I used to think of him as the real Bedros Afeyan, my grandfather, who had gone to the genocide and who had come back and gone again and was part of the German army and saved himself that way by helping build the Berlin-Baghdad line. So Tanti lived with us, and she told us about the Armenian history because my dad grew up in Bulgaria, and therefore he didn't know much about being Armenian. He went to Jesuit school and French school and this and that, and then there was war. So that kid, my dad, couldn't grow up being a real full-fledged Armenian, but grandmama did. And grandmama had gone to an American school, which she was very proud of, a Protestant school. And so she loved reading Longfellow, as she used to call him. So she's really the rock for me in terms of an intellectual life. She wanted me to be a doctor, and I always say, well, technically, I am a doctor. So I would say that's the important thing. My mother was an artist, was a pianist, and my dad was forced to be a businessman, even though he wanted to be an engineer, because in Lebanon, you couldn't be a civil engineer unless you owned the land and made the money on the land, and he was never Lebanese. So he was this Bulgarian guy who didn't know Arabic, who didn't have working papers. The amount of trouble these people faced is so huge compared to us. We had it good, and now hopefully the next generations will have it better.
You spoke about Armeno-Israeli, and her brother was your grandpa, I believe. There is an interesting story about how your grandpa survived the genocide.
Yeah, I know. That's the story I tell over and over again, yes.
I would like to hear it, please.
All right. So the way Noubar tells the story is not the truth. So the truth, and of course, who knows what the truth is?
Yeah.
But let's just say that Gurjade. So he has a way of streamlining it, for his maybe his handlers do it. I don't know what the deal is, but it's not what we learned.
Yeah.
The real story is that they had guns in their house, and one of their Turkish employees, they were very, very big people. They had Deutsche Armenische Bank, first of all. So they had a bank. They were very famous egg merchants, and they sold eggs to the German government. And so trainloads of Afeyan brothers' eggs went to Germany from Adapazar. So they had hen farms, I guess. But they were bankers. And because my grandfather dealt with Germany, he had become fluent in German. So what really saved his life, I'm going to tell you a number of things that saved his life. One of the things that saved his life is that he was a fluent German speaker, like I speak English, for instance. So even though he was in Adapazar, he spoke German like a German. But he didn't know that's going to help with anything, just something he did. So when they took him to the desert to be killed, they came by this, they escaped, they gave money and escaped, and were hiding, and they came upon a German barrack which was building this Berlin-Baghdad line. So he goes up to the colonel, and remember, he's a banker, right? And the guy says, do you know anything about accounting? My grandfather says, yeah, a little bit, here and there. So the guy says, well, look at these books, because I think the Greeks and the Turks are stealing. So he looks at the bank books, all the butter, all the eggs, it's all being stolen. None of the numbers add up. So he tells them, well, there's these discrepancies, whatever. That's it, you're going to be my lieutenant. Because he's speaking German, right? And so he becomes that guy's lieutenant, and little by little, kicks out these Turks and Greeks who are stealing. And this is the famous part of the story. And this train is also taking Armenian genocide victims to be killed. So they have these train accidentally stop nearby once in a while. They take out people, hide them, and then give them these jobs. So many, many people were saved through this process, which of course had to be done sotto voce, right? You couldn't just openly do this stuff. It would be disaster. So one of his favorite stories is that, so he was the translator for the colonel. So whenever the Turks came to complain, they had to talk to my grandfather so that he would translate to the colonel. So one of the habits that the Germans had was that they gave their chien loup, their German shepherds, Turkish names. So when they were watching movies at night, these dogs would start howling, oh, and they say, Raus, Mohammed, Ahmed, let it, shut up, schnell, this and that. So the Turks were being offended by this. How can you take the Prophet's name in vain and kick the dog and give it a Muslim name? So they went to complain to the colonel. And so they talked to my grandfather and said, please explain to the colonel that this is offensive to us. And so my grandfather explains it to the colonel. And this is my grandmother telling us the story. So, and the colonel turns and says, Bedros, Peter, I'm very surprised they're the ones who are complaining. I thought the dogs would be complaining. So now my grandfather's in a position of having to keep his straight face and say this to the Turks. Well, the problem really is that the dogs haven't come to complain. Anyway, so that's the kind of guy he was. So then he came back, then they in police, and then they arrested him again, and he was taken back. And he did this 3 times. And the 3rd time, they settled in Bolis. And the reason the family was not slaughtered is because they had, a home in Bolis and a home in Adapazar. So when the thing started, they went to Bolis, where people were not taken away because they were pretending nothing's going on. So they couldn't do it in front of the eyes of the, other embassies. And now to tell you the real story. My grandfather was good friends with the Persian ambassador. Mm-hmm. Just personal friendship. At one of these big parties at some embassy, that struck up a friendship. Now, my family in the 14th century comes from Persia, so they had that in common. My 3-4 generations earlier, they'd owned boats, ships. Because of those ships, which one of them had gone down in the Gulf of Hormuz, my great-grandfather had to go and get citizenship, whatever that meant, 200 years ago, to be able to get up in court and argue for getting his money back, which he did. And so there were those connections. So they talked about that, blah, blah, blah. Okay. And we are the Armenians from Adapazar who went to Vienna and came back, which is called Nemseler region, whatever. So, they had green eyes. My grandmother had green eyes. So let's not ask about how that happened. But, it is what it is. So they're fair skinned. My darker complexion comes from my mom's side. My brother's complexion comes from my dad's side. So they were friends. Genocide happens. They go to Bulgaria to get away from Atatürk, starting to tax non-Muslims again. My grandfather says, I'm not putting up with this again. I know this is how it starts. So he goes to Bulgaria. Communists come, as my dad liked to say, and liberate Bulgaria from its freedom. So now they want to get out. And there's a rule in the early 50s that says if you can prove that you belong to a foreign nationality, you can get out. Mm-hmm. So they go, why don't we write to this guy and say to the Iranian ambassador of all of Eastern Europe, by the way, there was no Bulgarian, and just say, we used to have a connection. Maybe they're desperate. They're looking for a way to get out. So they write to the guy. It's that guy's son. Says, my father spoke so highly of you, of your dad. My dad writes to him that absolutely. So they get Persian passports and get out of Bulgaria. It's an absolute luck thing. Now they settle in Lebanon. They're not Lebanese. Oh, they go to Greece. Oh, they go back to Turkey. That's the other funny thing. Mm-hmm. They even try going back to Turkey. I mean, Hayera Pamachesovi. So 4 times in his life, he tries to make it in Turkey. Then, of course, there's a lot of putches going on in Turkey in the 50s. They were having these military putches. I don't know if you know your history of Turkey. And so they feel that's unsafe. Go to Greece. Greece has communist takeover things going on. Okay, that's not safe. So they finally settle in Beirut. So that's how it is that my dad is a young man with a mother, a sister, whose father dies, no working papers, no passport, doesn't know a word of Arabic, is stuck in Lebanon. And from that, so he wanted to be an engineer, but how could he be an engineer under these circumstances? He had a friend in the CIA, a very, very good friend of our family's, who told him Beirut's finished. Mm-hmm. So in 1975, he told him this place will never go back to what it was. So that was an uncle of ours. We grew up. His son is still a friend of mine. He's in Florida, where we still communicate. We're not on the same side of the political spectrum, so it's a problem. But other than that, he's still a dear friend of mine. By the way, he was kidnapped by the Palestinians. But anyway, it's a long story.
Mhm.
The point is, this head of station in Lebanon, who was a very good friend of ours, said, Beirut is finished. Well, he was right. So first of all, this is 1975. Had we stayed in Beirut, there would be nobody solving the COVID-19 problem today. I mean, it's that simple. Or if the Turks had succeeded, there would be no solution to the COVID-19 problem, which is an interesting thing to think about. But anyway, the reason my dad wanted to leave was because he knew that for Armenians, it's always going to be a problem. Because he saw that in Bulgaria, right? Minorities, the way minorities get hounded after a war and blamed, people look for excuses. So Christians did this. Now, the Lebanese civil war has taken a different tone. Different people have been blamed. It's not far-fetched. It's correct analysis. That wasn't what the CIA guy was telling it. The CIA guy had no opinion about whether Armenians should stay there or not. But my dad thought, this is not the right place for Armenians. And I believe he was 100% right.
There's so much you have done. You have reviewed many books. You have reviewed movies, The Promise, Ararat. You also reviewed, since you brought up Persian stories, Dr. Vartan Grigorian's book, Road Back to Home. Born Tabriz, he conquered all the major institutions of the world.
It is remarkable. It is just a remarkable story.
What was most impressive about his story?
What is interesting is how important Jemaran was for him.
And
he says everything he learned about how to run an organization. I mean, remember, look what you're hearing.
Yeah.
This is a guy who was vice president of the University of Pennsylvania, who was president of Brown University, who was solicited with great enthusiasm to be the president of MIT, of Berkeley. I mean, this is just the stratosphere. And he says everything he learned, let me say this again, he learned from Levon Shant and Jemaran.
I don't want to correct you. I'm sure you're right, but I think he learned everything from Vratsian. He was the eyes.
Vratsian. Yeah.
Okay.
So anyway, whoever was in charge of Jemaran.
Vratsian.
It's before my time.
Yeah.
Now, what is interesting about that story is that he was kisherotik. He was in boarding school in a place which isn't set up to be boarding school because he came from Iran. Okay, so there's two things that are very important. One is he couldn't eat on weekends. So the food is only served to the students during the week. So on weekends, he would have one sandwich and he would have to live with that one. And he never complained. This is what I love about this guy. He's tough as nails. He put his education ahead of his stomach, and he was a loyal. Also, he was screwing up. I mean, the point is he was a screw up. He stayed in high school too long. He was an extra year, et cetera, et cetera. By the time he went to Stanford, he was 21 or something. So, and he had done the Hayaki Dagan as well, which is the whole point of going to Jemaran for foreigners. So he had studied Armenian studies, which is, an esoteric exercise in learning Karapar and first. But the most remarkable thing about his life, which is the purpose of the book, which is the way the book is set up as well, is that his father was a son of a bitch who never helped him, who never wanted to teach him, who gave English lessons to other children, but would pay no attention to him. And that is the psychology of motherhood, that his mother died, who doted over him, and his sister, and then a younger bride was brought in. And that bride didn't want to have anything to do with the old children. And so the father couldn't pay attention to them lest he piss off his current wife. And the luck is that he met a much older French diplomat in Persia who took him under his wing, who is the one who insisted that he go to Jemaran, which then made this guy, again, the New York public library system would not exist today if it wasn't for the man who was saved by a French diplomat to be sent to bed. I mean, that's what I love. It's an amazing story. And, as he says, that he got to be in charge of the Carnegie Foundation, whose main purpose is to build libraries all over the world. Talk about that arc. Start off not being able to read one book, and come out, start giving away libraries. It's a remarkable life.
Bedros, it's amazing how you bring up all these stories and you're so well read about this whole issue. Just as you mentioned Armenia Israelian, another person who was very much involved with Vartan Grigor's life was his grandma. It was to visit her grandma.
Yes. Oh, no, that's right. No, that's true. We have that in common. That's correct. That's correct. So he knew who he was through his grandmother. You're right.
And you went to visit her, whatever. Let me go into your scientific world. I mean, it's a very different world. I don't know how deep we can move into it, but tell us something of what you do, if you can simplify it.
Okay, so mostly I work in what's called the nonlinear optics of plasmas, or what happens when big lasers interact with very, very hot matter. So very strong lasers heating up matter, and then with the hope of getting fusion one day, which is this clean form of energy. One of the ways you get that is you got to put the laser energy in. And the laser, which is a coherent source of radiation, which is to say waves that are all moving up and down together, can cause other waves to move so that the whole thing falls apart. And so those processes, which is called the nonlinear optics of plasmas, the complicated way in which plasmas responds to lasers, need to be tamed. So I've invented methodologies of doing that and studied it for the last 40 years. And so one of them is called stud pulses, which stands for spike trains of uneven duration and delay, which says take the laser and make it into this thing that the plasma can't know is coming. It's not just turned on, but looks like on and off and on and off, and you fool it. It's about machine learning. It's about artificial intelligence. It's about nonlinear dynamics, which is to say complicated dynamics of systems, and many body theory, as it's called, how many particles interact with each other. So it's a very, very rich field, and it has many aspects to it, and that's mostly what I work on, but I work on other ththings as well.
You mentioned your wife. Is she also a scientist? I understand she works with you.
She works with me. She's an electrical engineer by training, and then she was a science teacher, and then she was a school principal, and she's highly literate. She has very, very strong Armenian knowledge, and she used to write beautifully in Armenian newspapers in Lebanon and in LA, where she's from. So in fact, she had a column where she would translate science articles from Scientific American or New York Times into Armenian, but the Armenian was so powerful and pure that people used to read that column who, let's be honest, Armenians don't know much about science, didn't really care about science, but they cared about the Armenians. So she had fans all over the world who admired the purity of her grasp of the Armenian language. So it was very nice. I've written many poems where I've translated some of my English stuff to Armenian with her help, and vice versa. So she has strong opinions about how things should be named, and I have other opinions. So we can make a nice go of it.
You know, it's just amazing talking to you. I'm learning so much. The Armenian world is changing every single day. The whole planet is changing. But when you speak about the purity of the Armenian language, the writing of your wife, what are your thoughts when we in America are losing it, definitely, and we don't have a single newspaper editor who was born and raised in America, or that we are not able to bring or continue to promote the Armenian language? Forget the purity of
the counterexample to that is Montreal. So
Montreal,
if you go that route, Montreal does have Armenians who speak Armenian and who are born there.
Who are born there.
As well as LA, by the way. So except for LA and Montreal, it's hopeless. It's never going to get anywhere.
You're talking about recent immigrants, Montreal and LA.
No. I'm talking about, let me be more general than that. In Montreal is the only place I lived in where Greeks who were born in Montreal speak Greek, and Armenians speak Armenian, and Italians speak Italian, and there's no problem.
Because of the proximity, you know, it's Montreal is not a normal
mindset. It's not just proximity. That helps. No. I mean, assume I know something about this, okay? It's my hometown. So it's not just that. It's the mindset. It's that a culture that already is formed on two languages can tolerate a few more languages. I have, Ukrainian friends from Alberta who went back to Alberta so that their kids, they were growing up in LA, would not just be assimilated and grow near the church and near the language, and now they're all Ukrainian-speaking Albertans. So it's really not an Armenian phenomenon. It's a Canadian phenomenon. We should give it credit. The country is tolerant. It's not racist. Now, indigenous people have some problems, but they have to be dealt with. In the U.S., racism is baked in, as it's in the news. You don't need me to tell you. And so, removing racism as the mindset, no Jews or Armenians need apply. Signs like this, which used to be on walls, or no Indians, dogs, or Armenians allowed in this bar. People who get away with this sort of thing. I mean, if you think, I was just thinking the other day, by the way, and I haven't thought this through very much. If you think of your ancestor somewhere, you don't think of them as wearing a pistol, right? Right?
Right, absolutely.
Anywhere in the world, Paris.
Yes.
Greece, yeah. What do you think Americans think of their ancestor in this country? There's a guy wearing a couple of revolvers walking around. I mean, it's an extremely aggressive thing. So it's a different culture.
It's a different culture, It's getting a little bit. Let's go back to Armenian life. My question is, when were you in Armenia last time?
Okay, I was there once in 2005.
Once.
And once in 1972.
What do you think of what's happening there?
I hear people I know who go all the time tell me that it's getting much better. I can tell you that I don't like hearing Russian being spoken in the streets of Yerevan. That I can tell you.
But it's slowly fading.
And the young kids like to speak Russian. It's understandable, but it's also deplorable and worrisome.
But half the population works in Russia. And when they come back, you expect them to speak English?
I know. I'm not saying they shouldn't. I'm just saying it worries me. The schools, I think, first of all, as far as the language is concerned, we have to be careful about this Russification of the language, or the communistification of the language in the 1930s. That's just got to go. Calling Yerevan, Irivan and stuff, that's just, somebody ought to get slapped for doing that. That's preposterous. And because it serves no purpose except a very racist, negative, it's an attempt to denigrate our own culture by our own hands. It's ridiculous. So we should fight that. There's a question of Eastern and Western Armenians. So I know you're dying to ask me about Beirut Armenians going to Armenia. So let's just jump to it.
That's a major question.
So it's very important for Beirut Armenians or Syrian Armenians who are not doing great to consider going to Armenia and taking the beauty of our culture with them, which I think could be nourishment and a mindset, right? I mean, it took 70 years for communists to take the entrepreneur spirit, wipe it right out of Armenians, which we didn't lose in the West. So the savoir-faire that Armenians have, and the jarbigutun, and the, taking care of yourself. The word that I hate that is Soviet, that we don't have, thank God, in the West, is chustatsvets. This idea that things can be received. We don't talk about receiving anything in the West. We expect to earn things. In Soviet mindset, you expect to receive things. That's when, Father Russia gives you this, and Father Russia, and screw that is my point. That's a heroin addiction. You got to get away from that. Of course, it requires discipline, and it's easy to speak, right? When people are starving. So how to make Armenians healthy enough, intellectually, morally, and spiritually so that they can take care of themselves like they have over the last few millennia. That's, to me, the important question. Not so much how can you provide them with a piece of bread, like the old saying is, teach them how to fish, don't give them fish. Teach them how to go fish themselves. So I think from that point of view, knowing foreign languages is very important, computer science, things like this, machine learning. The intellectual life should be richer, but also taking pride in Armenian culture and living Armenian culture. So there's a friend of mine you should interview. His name is Bedros Afeyan. He runs Guru.
I know him. Yes.
Yeah, so Asped and I, a long time ago, when we were one of the first few people doing Ararat, which was a electronic way of talking to each other, we said we need it so we can live as Armenians. So in our daily lives, there's something Armenian. So if I write, or if I paint khachkars or something like this, it's an attempt, it's a little clin d'oeil to keep something Armenian alive, not just look back and say, the old Armenian way and the old thing. So for instance, I do all these khachkars, which are multicolor, right, with bursting colors. Well, there's no such thing, but I want it to be beautiful with today's standards, not by the standards of 14th century.
This morning I was talking to some friends, and the two major issues for topic was the Beirut blast and also Nikol Pashinyan's appearance on Hard Talk. Have you seen him interviewed?
I have written about that.
What do you take? What did you write?
Well, what I wrote, first of all, people just were bursting out on Facebook with
that's
humongous disdain but that's just the Soviet style. I mean, people have to understand where Soviets come from. So let me give you another example, which you think is going to be irrelevant, but it actually is. So Solzhenitsyn, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the famous dissident, used to get into trouble in the U.S. because whenever somebody wanted to interview him in Vermont, he would send them questions and answers. They go, what the hell is this? That's what they were used to in the Soviet times. An interview was one where if you agreed to it, you wrote down the questions, you wrote down the answers, and you gave it to the guy. And the best you could hope for is that some of that would survive. They wouldn't just edit it any way they want. So he wasn't trying to be insulting. It's just what he was used to. American journalists took that as a supreme insult. Same way, these people who are just so upset with this jerk-off in the BBC trying to get clickbait, asking preposterous questions, which are outlandish. It's the old joke in the U.S. is, when did you stop beating your wife? This question has no answer. There's no way you can answer this without incriminating yourself. So that's what he was doing. It's an old trick, right? So when are you going to apologize for what you did to the Azeris? He did spectacularly well. So I thought he was magnificent. I think we are not the one responsible. We are good. And I'm sorry, I'd like to tell you that you're being belligerent. I'm not being belligerent. You're being belligerent. So it was fantastic. He just took this. He wiped his arse with this guy. It was perfect. But to Armenians, who are extremely thin-skinned, the fact that somebody's asking a question, just like Solzhenitsyn, who couldn't believe a journalist would have the chutzpah to ask a question as opposed to just take the tablet, he's given. They just got to get over that. And I think that guy screwed up. Anyway, if you do some studies on him, you realize that he's hidden information about Turkey that's negative from interviews. He's taken it out. That's all online. So he is agenda-driven. He's trying to act like he can get at something that nobody else can. I find that despicable and unprofessional. But I thought Pashinyan did well. What did you think?
Well, I'm asking myself, did he know what he was getting into? Did his advisor tell him or knew what he was getting into? Hard talk is not a choir you face. It's a hard talk. I mean, anything goes. Was he prepared? I think his English was very, very impressive. I really, really think so. And I think
He also made a bunch
passing
of
grade.
mistakes. Let's not. He made a lot of terrible mistakes. But that happens. Oh, he gave all the wrong numbers. He said Artsakh is 18% Armenian, stuff like that.
Sitting.
So but he was being really cooked. I mean, the guy was just cooking it, and I thought he resisted the heat pretty well. Turned it back. I enjoyed that huge watch he was wearing. That was very manly, I thought. He's got this huge mechanical device on his hand. He's like, listen to me. And he just in his face. It was marvelous. I wouldn't hire that guy Sukor, or whatever his name is, to do anything.
Stevens.
Can't stand him. But he's got into trouble. Now, he also, you should go look. I looked up some stuff about him. He is interviewed, for instance, this British-Turkish author, very famous lady, who just blasts Turkey in her interview, and there's nothing he can do about it. Mm-hmm. So, that made it through. On the other hand, whenever they brought up some terrorists or something like that, they cut it out in some other interviews. So, but that's already been pointed out. So I posted that as well. So
I think since you brought up that name, I think he also interviewed the opposition of Venezuelan Maduros, and it was Vanessa Neumann. If you have a chance, you will enjoy watching that hard talk with Vanessa Neumann. She really came back beautifully.
Shafak, I think, is the name of this Turkish author. My wife.
Oh, Shafak. Okay.
Yeah, so, and she just blasts. He doesn't stop her. So I was waiting to see if whenever somebody's dumping on Turkey, which is the easiest thing to do, there's no limit of what you can say about what's wrong with Turkey. Whether he would interfere and try to justify. He never did. He just let her talk. So, good. Oh, so that's the story I should tell you. So people ask whether I met my wife in Beirut or not.
Yeah.
And this is the story. And the answer is no. But she went to Khanamilian. Khanamilian is next to the Beirut main church, which is called, anyway, the Beirut main church's name will come to me in a second. So, not Giligian main church, which is Antilias, but the Beiruti Arash Nortarana, Shuk Nishan. Well, anyway, that's where I sang, and that's where my brother sang. So now, why did we sing? So this again tells you something about the cleverness of my family. So my father sent us to Armenian Protestant school because that had the best chances of getting to AUB, which was a very, very important thing. If you wanted to think of the future of your children, we were destined to go to AUB, and Kalaki High School was a good way to get there. Okay? Point is, they're trying to indoctrinate you. Mm-hmm. And so they couldn't say no. I mean, it's a Christian church. So they could say, okay, they wanted to up the ante. So the ante was that you had to be a tabir.
Serving, yeah.
So remember, their Sunday mass is half an hour long. Yeah. And it's 5 minutes from our home. While our church is half an hour from our home, and it's 5 hours long. So my father had the great presence of heart go, my sons will become tabirs. I'm like, wait a minute, buddy. Who agreed to this deal? Now, you might think, was he a religious man? Absolutely not. Remember, he's from Europe. He's a Bulgarian Armenian. He doesn't care about religion at all. But he liked his wife. And he didn't know how to have his wife. And the most important thing to have his wife was to have his 3 extremely noisy kids away. So he figured out a way to screw the school, screw the Protestants, get us to go to church, make us full Armenians because we sang in Karapar for 5 hours every bloody Sunday. And we were so gullible that we did it, and you could go, why were you so Hashim? Why did you agree to this? Because we loved Knefe B'Zibin. And we were allowed to eat Knefe B'Zibin on our way to church. And that to us was like a kingly price, 75 cents, by which we could buy Knefe B'Zibin, eat it slowly, go up the hill, sing for 5 hours, and then, and this is how I know this is what was going on. I'm not going to tell you what was going on, but you're going to figure it out for yourself. He'd come to pick us up from church, smiling ear to ear, and ask, where do you guys want to go? I'm like, what happened to this guy? What possibly did he just do over the last 5 hours? Which, as a 10-year-old, I couldn't figure out. But now I know exactly what he was doing. He had a beautiful time with his wife, quiet, coffee in bed, etc., while we sang our hearts out every Sunday for 5 years before we immigrated. Then I sang in Montreal. We all sang in Montreal. And I sang in Washington, D.C., and in San Francisco as well. So, yes, I've sung all my life in the Armenian church.
It's a very unique experience to serve the church. You get to know the community, and you know, you get to get close to the Armenian life. That's kind of amazing.
It's played a very important role in my life. Also, the Protestant education, because maybe when you sang, you didn't know what you were singing. But because we also got the Ashkarapan version in Protestant school, we could make the connection. So I actually know what is being sung, even though I don't know Karapan, you know, a priori.
You know, since we are talking in this, you are so easy to talk to, honestly. I did not think we will go this far. But you as a literary guru editor, what do you make out of the young talents, young forces that are out there, but nobody hears about them? What do you see as interesting?
Well, we are open to I just think people should take themselves seriously. The only thing I would say is, in physics or in all these things, or take my brother, for instance, he's not trying to be the best Armenian biophysicist, right, or biotechnologist. Mm-hmm. He's trying to be the best biotechnologist, period. Mm-hmm. In the same way, I'm not trying to be the best Armenian physicist or best Armenian poet. I'm going to be the best bloody poet I can be. Mm-hmm. And that attitude, as long as Armenians have that attitude, we're going to do just fine. But sometimes the ghettoistic tendencies are to compare ourselves to each other and try to outdo each other instead of trying to go for excellence, period, which is a lot more work. So that's what I would say. If you don't, you know, take yourself seriously. You know, try to beat the best poetry in the world, the best comedy in the world. Don't have Armenian jokes. Have the best jokes in the world you can possibly come up with. And then you'll do well. I think that's what I would say. So Armenians who've done that, that's how they've excelled. And, you know, that's all we got is our wits. Land is obtained through military means. It's not done by talking. And Armenians have to understand that. There is no negotiated way in which land is going to be recovered. The same thing is true with Israel and the Arabs. You know, Israel isn't going to give up anything. And you have to earn that land. I'm not a militarist. I'm not saying we should go out and do war. I'm just saying we have to be realistic. Nobody's giving you land. You're not going to talk your way into getting land. So when the terrorists were doing what they were doing, they were making it very difficult for Turks to just continue their bullshit. So we have to find ways to not let them continue on their path of bullshit. So when you take guys like Taner Akjam, etc., Shafak, other Turks who will speak like rational, you know, conscientious, modern human beings, then we have to embrace them, and we have to promote them, and we have to work with them. So the example to remember is from the history of Israel. So Chaim Weizmann was a chemist during the First World War, and he helped the British Admiralty figure out how to deal with chemical warfare. And it was because of him that they didn't lose the First World War. So after the war, they went to him and they said, what do you want? Whatever you want. He said, I want Israel. That's what it takes. You have to put something up. You have to give something that is irreplaceable to be able to ask the international community to take you seriously. Bloviating isn't going to do it. Talking about rights and sevr, tashnakir, and whatever isn't going to do a bloody thing. So helping the opposition within Turkey to find a way to topple this dictatorial regime is the number one role. Now, let's also look at what role did Russia play historically? Russia is the number one reason Armenians have never done anything. Russia is not the reason why we survived. Russia is the reason we've never done anything. They stopped even Project Nemesis in the 1920s. That was Russia saying, don't, because we're going to bring Turkey over, and then we'll figure it out. This feeling that Russia has had, that it can manipulate Armenians any way it wants in order not to piss off Turks, is a problem we can solve. We have to put our demands ahead of just being the gerwachen sort, the kicked around ball of the geopolitical interests of much larger countries without losing track of the fact that they have those interests. Don't blind yourself. So Armenians tend to have these huge emotional responses instead of rationally realizing there's a chess game going on and you better play the pieces you have and optimize that and not try to dream up solutions which are way beyond the realm of the possible.
You spoke about land, fighting for land, and you have to fight for it. But how about genocide recognition? Do you
That's
think
what Turks believe. Turks believe you fight for land, and they're right. Okay, genocide recognition has to come, but you have to ask yourself, why isn't it being recognized? They don't want reparations. They're trying to make sure that they just push this as far away as possible. So by the time they do, like for instance, when the U.S., again, you always work with analogies. Take the example of American Indians, right? So the Americans finally admitted there are still records that are completely closed as to just how they were systematically killing off Indians in the forts, that you see in movies, these cowboys, those are all sealed records. That's 200 years ago. So what are you talking about? I mean, people don't admit, now, not just because Germany happens to be such anal retentives that they kept complete record of everything they were doing. Each they wrote down, so that those records exist. Chapter and verse, every village, every sock, every hat, every skin that they burned, you have a record of it. That's not how these things are done. So, do we want recognition? Absolutely. I've written hundreds of poems on this subject. Every year, go back to Gurung. Every year on April 24, there's an Armenian poem. In fact, on April 24, Gurung only publishes one thing, and that's my poem. Okay? So Gurung goes silent. Usually there's 1,000 news items every day. That day, there's nothing except one of my poems. And we've been doing this for 20 years. So we can ask, and we can teach, and we can instruct and educate. But the bottom line is, you have to understand why they're not doing it. And this is what Hrant Dink was doing. He was trying to understand it from a Turkish point of view. I don't share his views. I'm just saying I appreciate that he could bring that to the table, right? So we have to understand the Turkish point of view. We have to understand why they're playing what they're playing. And help them see the light. Help the Kurds, help the Arabs, take Lebanon. This is what that poem really says. Why do you think the poem, the port was blown up, and I'm talking about the next, I'm a chess player. the one thing you didn't mention about
Mhm.
me. You know, it's the next move that matters. The next move is Turkey is making huge inroads in Lebanon,
Absolutely.
and nobody knows about this. In Tripoli, etc. And I knew that this bomb will be a new opportunity. Just happened. The U.S. said it's not going to help. Right? Turkey is more than happy to help. What does that mean? You think they're doing it for humanitarian reasons? They have more political prisoners than anywhere else in the world, and all of a sudden they're going to help Lebanon for Lebanon's sake? Absolutely not. If they help Lebanon, it's for Turkey's sake. And I want my Lebanese brothers and sisters to know about that. That's what the poem really tries to say. And doesn't deny the fact that they also have to deal with Iran, which in fact is what's really going on. They're looking for places, whether it's Libya or Lebanon or the Bahrain, or to fight the Shia-Sunni war. That's their problem. But Girvachan Soralal is a thing we as Armenians understand. We shouldn't let the Lebanese become the next, you know, soccer ball on the geopolitical arena, which is just kicked around for no purpose until it deflates. That's what's happened to that poor country. So I feel sorry for it.
You know, we are working very hard in Washington, D.C. You have heard of ANCA. You have heard of the Armenian Assembly. How do you evaluate? What is your take of what we are able to do there?
Well, I like the ANCA. I contribute to them. The Assembly has been woefully ineffective. And in fact, interestingly enough, if you look at the resolutions that happened last year, it's remarkable that the U.S. Senate and the House unanimously, or almost unanimously, accepted the Armenian genocide, and it has nothing to do with Armenians. It's just a way to slap Turkey on the hand. So just the other day, Netanyahu gave a speech, which was, I saw it on Facebook, in Hebrew, but I know enough Hebrew to be able to, Armeni. He says, "Don't teach us anything, Mr. Erdogan. Why don't you deal with the Kurds and the Armenians?" I'm like, "What you did to the Armenians?" I'm like, "Wait a second. Your Knesset doesn't recognize what he did to the Armenians. So therefore, when it's convenient, all of a sudden we're their friends. When it's not convenient, they just..." So the hypocrisy of the world political order has to be taken into account. And yet, we were able to pass this through Congress. Nobody can say alleged genocide anymore, right? So these are huge steps, but it has nothing to do with us. There's bigger fish to fry. And ANCA did the work to wake people up to the need for this, but they were completely powerless, while Turkey's belligerence finally brought our Congress to do the right thing. So there's a lesson there, right? I don't know. What do you think?
Absolutely. No, whatever you're saying is absolutely right. I would like to just hear your point of view. And I think both ANCA and Assembly need more help. They need to be reorganized. They need to be maybe coming up with a unified front. They need money. They need manpower. They need much more to fight what they are working on. Bedros, if you were to talk to young people listening to you, young college students, people we are really looking for to hold on to for the future generation, what would you tell them?
Well, what I already did. I mean, you could say, don't try to be an incrementalist. So if you want to understand my brother, or, for instance, or my grandfather, or my father, right? They were not incrementalists. The incrementalism doesn't get you anywhere. Have a bug up your ass, be very, very driven to the point of... So one rule I followed, so you could say, you were saying it's amazing that you paint, you sculpt, I directed plays, etc. Okay, so how did I do it, right? At some bifurcation point in my life, when did I say I'm going to now direct a play? Well, the point is I don't give up on anything. So I don't say I'll direct a play or I'll do physics. I'll say, okay, I'll do both, which means more work. So embrace work. So one of my rules of life is whenever you face at an intersection a choice that's easy and a choice that's hard, just do the hard thing. Always do the hard thing. And that's what's gotten me what I have. Is never, ever, I'm always suspicious of taking the easy way, right? So for easy way, I would have become a singer. Easy way, I would have become a businessman. Easy way, I would have become whatever. But I decided I'm going to do theoretical physics, okay? That's not going to be easy. There's no way to bullshit in theoretical physics. This is what happened. So you didn't ask me how I became a physicist. So, see, I'm teaching you how to do your own job. So what happened is I'm 10 years old and we're in Beirut and we're on a balcony. From that balcony, we would have seen, by the way, this explosion at about 10 meters away from us. It would have been horrendous beyond any description. So this balcony was so high up on the 9th floor that you could see boats coming in, which would take 2 days to make it to port. I mean, that's how wide the beauty of the Mediterranean was in front of us, okay? So also there was not a lot of light pollution. Of course, at the time I didn't know this word, light pollution. So we're on the balcony, I'm looking up at the sky, and I'm 10 years old or 11, and there's gargantuan, beautiful stars. It's the Milky Way. And I asked my dad, at the time I thought he was omniscient, what is that? And his attitude was like, it doesn't matter what that is, go do your homework. And I thought, it doesn't matter what that is? Are you goddamn kidding me? Mm-hmm. So I had this realization right away, and it's an unbelievable thing that this happened, but I'm like, wait a minute, you will talk about how your neighbor did this and did that and didn't give you this and the bank didn't give you this stuff, for sure. And if I ask you what the stars are, this doesn't interest you. And then if I asked him, how does the light bulb work? He didn't know that either. I'm like, wait a second. You don't know how technology works. You don't know how nature works. And you're completely obsessed with human endeavors. Now, my suspicion was there's something wrong with caring about what humans are doing. I'm not interested in humans. I'm interested in knowledge. I want to know things for what they are and why they're not the way they could be. And this is what Noubar does. So Noubar will say, he will ask, what would make this a better world? How could we get there? He doesn't say, how can I take the next step? How can I write one more paper? How can I put my name on something? That kind of living isn't for us Armenians. And this, by the way, is beautifully described in a short story by Soroyan that I think you should read, called The Theological Student. I love this story. There's 2 stories by Soroyan I love, The Theological Student and The Foreigner. They both are vast life lessons, and I often read them out loud and to people or whatever. They kill, okay, in their wisdom. But read the one called The Theological Student and about his uncle Khosrow and so on, and you'll see exactly what I just said. He'll say, what are Armenians? What are Greeks? What are Greeks? It's remarkable. So that's what I would. You read these stories. Be inspired by the greatness of others. Don't be a nationalist chauvinist. Don't, my favorite kind of music is classical music. It's not Armenian, stuff, which I love, but it's not enough. My favorite poets are English. My favorite playwrights are American. My favorite authors are Russian. But, I'm Armenian. I'm proud of it, but I'm not just Armenian, right? So I try to be the best I can be. And if everybody does that, this will be a fantastic planet.
And one of my friends, when they heard that I was going to interview, asked me to ask you about why we do not have American Armenian artists besides the well-known Gorky, and what will your reaction be if, as you know, his grave is in New England somewhere, and it's very, very, it is just thrown away on the side. What is your response?
So I've written many poems about Gorky.
What have you not written about? Jesus Christ. Okay.
Many things, but I've never written openly about sex, for instance. But I've written about Gorky. So see, I'm still the boy who went to church and sang. That's the problem. I got to get over that. Vostanik Adoyan. So he's is an interesting story. You know, he told everybody he was a relative of Maxim Gorky.
Mm.
You know that, right?
Yes,
He
yes.
told people he was a cousin of Maxim Gorky.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
that's a pen name. How can you be the relative of a pen name?
Yeah.
This is like if I say I'm related to Ronald McDonald. You know, this just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And people bought it first. Second of all, his wife didn't know he's Armenian, so until he was dead. So I mean, it's just he was. Look, his Armenianness is an extremely weird thing. He was definitely crazy. He was definitely Tishvaragan. He had suffered so much, and at the hands of Armenians. So first, his father. His father rejected them. And when he came to the U.S. in Boston and tried to reach out to him to get stuff from him, the guy wouldn't respond, wouldn't help. And in fact, in Armenian Sirjarans in Boston, he would sit down and give away paintings for the coffee. I mean, this is not, you know, so the lesson for Armenians, it's an extremely important lesson there, is Chukharchetsenel, our artists.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll tell you again, I spoke highly of my parents and so on, but now let me denigrate them a little bit for you. One of the odd things about them was that they always spoke very highly of art as long as we were not artists. So my mom is a pianist, but she would have been appalled if I'd become a singer, which really is what I should have become. Because Shat Mechke, Haya Adang Abri Tishvaragan, she adored Chopin, Schumann, just would love, and Bach, just love them. But her biggest compliment was Sastik Harust. Mezaharust. Sastik Mezaharust. Like, you know that Chopin was not Sastik Mezaharust, right? So the poor woman, Armenians happen to have this double standard. My son can become, look, Jews, same thing, Chinese, you know, my son can become rich, but art is wonderful. Let's get over that, right? If our kids want to do art, let us push them into art. If they don't, you know, you can't have double standards. That's the problem, is that small-mindedness stops us from encouraging our own artists. And so Vaheb Berberian every Sunday talks about this. I don't know if you watch his show, but it's wonderful. Journalistin Shidakosing, you know, talks about how, you know, wit, comedy, art, theater, these things are not taken seriously at all. But look, in Dickens's time, nobody wanted their daughters to become actresses. That was the same thing as being a prostitute.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it's the same thing. All cultures have double standards. Somebody else's entertainment is great as long as it's not my daughter who has to get up on stage and perform. That's scandalous. So the moral fabric of Christian piety has a tendency to destroy a lot of beauty. On the other hand, you know, I'm not a big believer in hippie lifestyles either. So, you know, even the kibbutzes in Israel have failed. So, right? They tried that. So, you know, one has to use one's power in moderation and keep options open. That's what I'd say.
You know, when I mentioned Gorky, I also asked, how do you react to the fact that his grave is somewhere in New England, and nobody cares?
Well, the grave doesn't matter, right?
To Armenia or
the
something.
guy committed suicide and nobody helped him. After he committed suicide, you know, it's a little bit like Yossarian. Yossarian is a character in a novel called Catch-22.
22.
One of my favorite scenes, Alan Arkin plays him in the movie. Okay, now I'm dropping names, but these are all great actors. So Alan Arkin gets into this airplane where there's this dead kid, you know, with his guts open. And he's talking on the radio, describing what he's doing. So he says, He looks old. He's a little kid, right? In a bomber with his guts all open. So he says he's old. He goes, old? He gives the name. He says, 22. He says he's dead. How much older can you get? So that's the point, right? Arshil Gorky killed himself at a very early age. He was beating his wife. He was a drunkard. He had broken his neck. He was afraid he's not going to be able to paint again. Anyway, as I said, I've written all this many times in many poems. The Armenian community couldn't help a guy like that. It's very difficult to help a guy like that. Jackson Pollock killed himself. Many artists. Van Gogh might have killed himself. So, that's my hero. So it's not in their 30s. So it's a remarkable thing is that how the hell did I survive to be 61? That's the real question. I mean, it's just that I find miraculous. But other than that, I understand artists, burning their candle from both ends and then being left with nothing. So the community should encourage young people to express themselves and not to judge. We tend to so if you study the psychology a little bit, you'll realize that they're covering up their own lack of understanding and their own lack of knowledge and their own failures by imposing on the next generation a way to not do the things they didn't bring themselves to do, which is preposterous. So instead of enabling the next generation, they try, while all kids want to do with their hormones is to break the rules. So let them break the rules. Let's embrace life. And that's something you can do in Hayastan. So there, we can land there. Only in Hayastan can Armenians build enough that it might self-sustain itself. Nowhere else. Everywhere else, it's faking it. Okay, thanks a lot. You're a wonderful man, and good luck with you. I'll watch your other ones.
Հաջելիեր խոսիլ ցերդան գերեջև շատ թեթև բան ունի, personality շատ թեթև է։ Այստեղ մեծության վրա թեթևությունը նարդայել դա։ Շնորհակալություն։
Խապեմ։
Okay, be good.
Bye.